Rejected by her own family, Clara was forced to marry a homeless man. What no one knew was that this man was hiding a secret that could change his destiny forever. The dirt floor of the small house barely supported the footsteps of those who lived there. The cracked walls told stories of unkept promises, and the roof, full of exposed holes, cried along on rainy nights. The girl, named Clara, washed the dishes with dirty water drawn from the creek, while her stomach growled from hunger. Her large, deep eyes had already cried more than any 17-year-old should. Her father, a man hardened by poverty, spent his days between the hoe and debts that grew like weeds. Her mother, resigned and silent, only watched her daughter be consumed by a reality that had never offered her a choice. Around the village, misery was the rule, but in Clara's house, it seemed to have built a permanent home. Each day was a bitter repetition of the last, with less hope and more weariness. When food was available, it was shared among the younger siblings. Clara, being the oldest, had learned to swallow both hunger and pride. She studied with borrowed books and torn notebooks, nurturing a dream that seemed increasingly distant, to escape, to change her story. But even dreams began to feel heavy, because reality was stronger than any girl's imagination. The bills never stopped arriving, even though no one paid them. A local loan shark, known for his cruelty, threatened to take everything, even the few pieces of furniture in the house. It was in this desperate setting that tragedy began to unfold. Cornered, the family searched for a way out, and soon the cruelest idea emerged, a solution that would require a sacrifice Clara never imagined she would have to make. On a silent night, while the younger siblings slept curled up in a corner of the living room, Clara's parents exchanged looks that said more than words. The father, his voice choked with shame, suggested something even he couldn't believe, marrying off their daughter to a man despised by all in exchange for temporary relief. The mother, hesitant, tried to resist, but misery had long silenced her will. The man in question was a wanderer who lived in the abandoned ruins on the other side of the village. Dirty, quiet, and wrapped in mystery, few even knew his name. But days earlier he had appeared at the family's door with a sack of rice, 2 live chickens, and a bottle of oil, saying he could help, if he got something in return. It was a strange offer from someone who seemed to have even less than they did. The proposal was simple and cruel. He would give them food and wood for the stove in exchange for a wife. He didn't want love or children, just someone to share the space with. He claimed to have lived alone long enough. The father, pressured by the children's hunger and the loan shark's demands, saw the offer as the only possible relief. And as always, Clara was the one to pay the price of desperation. When the mother told Clara what was to be done, the light in her eyes vanished for good. There was no screaming, no resistance, just the silence of someone who had already suffered too much. With her heart crushed, she felt like she was ceasing to exist as a person and becoming just a solution. No one cried, no one hugged her. The decision had been made, and her worth had been measured in sacks of flour. Clara was taken to the shack where the man lived, barefoot and with a lost look in her eyes. The sun beat down on the dirt road, and each step was a farewell to the few certainties she had left. The village watched in silence, with eyes filled with a mix of pity and fear. The girl walked beside her father, unsure whether she was still a daughter or just a walking debt being paid off. Upon arriving at the rotting wooden hut, Clara saw the man who would be called her husband for the first time. Sitting in the shade of a gnarled tree, he observed without expression. His face was dirty, his beard long and unkempt, and his clothes nothing but rags. Even so, there was something in his posture that didn't match the image of misery, a kind of quiet dignity that escaped the common eye. The father handed over the girl with a brief and dry gesture, like someone fulfilling a contract and leaving without looking back. Clara stood still, trying to understand if it was real or just another nightmare. The man didn't approach, didn't speak, he simply stood up and pointed to the cabin. And so she entered, carrying her own body as if it were a burden. Inside the shack, the air was dominated by the smell of damp wood and dust. An old mattress on the floor, a dirty pot in the corner, and a tattered blanket were the only possessions. Clara sat, hugging her knees, trying to hold back the sobs that threatened to come. Outside, the man's silence blended with the sound of the dry wind, and the first day of her new life began with fear, pain, and silence. The wedding was improvised the next day, with only 2 witnesses and no smiles. There was no dress, no rings, no vows, only the cold formalization of an agreement forged out of need. Clara wore an old dress of her mother's, hastily washed and stained in ways soap couldn't fix. Her eyes remained downcast, as if even shame had given up on showing itself. The man remained silent throughout the ceremony. He only nodded when necessary, like someone performing a ritual he didn't want but accepted. Clara stayed still, like a forgotten doll. She didn't even look into his eyes. She didn't know his full name or what he expected from her. All she knew was that she was now his wife, a wife bought with hunger. At the end of the ceremony, the few attendees quickly dispersed. Clara's family didn't stay for sweet words or farewells. Her mother handed her a bag with some clothes, mumbled something inaudible, and turned her back. Her father didn't even come close. Clara stood still for a few minutes, watching her old life leave without even a wave. Alone beside the stranger with whom she now shared a name, Clara felt the weight of everything she had lost. But there was also a hidden spark of something different. Not hope, but perhaps resilience. A kind of silent strength that is born when everything else has been taken away. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she had to survive. And there, in that old shack, her greatest challenge was about to begin. The shack where Clara would spend her days didn't look like a place meant for human beings. The wall planks were loose, letting in the cold night wind. An old cloth covered the only window, and on the floor there was only a torn rug where the man slept. Clara observed everything with a tight chest, feeling more distant from any idea of home. The man, still silent, made no attempt to impose anything. He simply offered the cleanest corner of the floor for her to rest. Clara, still standing, watched his curved back as he walked away, as if he too felt uncomfortable with the situation. There was something enigmatic in his posture, an absence of aggression, but also an absence of emotion. That first night, Clara could barely close her eyes. The sounds of nature around them seemed louder than ever, and the silence between her and the man made everything more suffocating. Her body ached, but what weighed most was the feeling of abandonment. Sleeping there, on the cold floor, next to a stranger, felt like being buried alive in a reality that wasn't hers. But even amid such discomfort, something surprised her. He didn't try to approach. He didn't speak, didn't touch, didn't demand. The fear that dominated her began to give way to strangeness. This wasn't what she expected. And in the darkness of the shack, covered by a thin cloth, Clara fell asleep for the first time without tears, just confusion. The following days followed a silent and almost ritualistic pattern. The man woke before sunrise, left without saying where he was going, and returned with some firewood or fruit picked from nearby. He never asked for anything, nor did he complain. When they ate, it was in silence. When they shared the space, it was as if 2 ghosts coexisted in different planes. Clara, little by little, began to tidy up the shack. She cleaned the floor with scraps of old cloth, reorganized the few rusty pots, and tried to turn the place into something minimally bearable. There was something healing in the small gestures, hanging a clean cloth, lighting a candle, making room to breathe. It was as if the external cleaning reflected an attempt to calm the mess inside her. Even without words, a routine was beginning to form between them. The man always left a larger portion of food for her. He gave up space on the mattress. He fetched water from the creek so she could bathe, even though he never said a single word. That lack of demands was too strange for someone who had lived a life surrounded by abuse and commands. Clara began watching him more closely. She noticed his movements were always restrained, calculated, as if there were far more inside him than he let on. His appearance remained scruffy, but his eyes, there was something in his eyes. Something that didn't make sense yet but was starting to stir an uncomfortable question in her. Who really was this man? One day, Clara burned the food out of distraction. She was preparing a simple soup but forgot about the fire while washing some clothes. When she smelled the burning, she rushed back and saw everything ruined. Her heart raced, bracing for yelling, maybe even violence. Memories from her parents' home had taught her to expect the worst. But when he returned, he simply observed the situation for a few seconds and, without any negative reaction, took the pot off the fire. The simple gesture left her bewildered. She expected punishment and received indifference, or perhaps understanding. He wasn't upset. He said nothing. He just threw the food away and went into the forest to fetch more cassava. That behavior, however mysterious it was, made her feel something she hadn't felt in a long time: relief. For the first time, she wasn't treated like a walking mistake. From that day on, Clara began to move with less fear inside the shack. She still spoke little, but her presence was no longer just a shadow. She began to hum quietly while washing dishes. She organized a corner with dry leaves as support for her old books. She even hung wildflowers in a makeshift vase made from a broken bottle. It wasn't much, but it was something. And as the days went by, that silent coexistence began turning into something deeper than she could name. There was no intimacy, no direct affection, but there was respect. And for someone who had been traded like merchandise, that respect was worth more than gold. On the coldest night of the month, Clara shivered beneath the thin blanket that barely covered her feet. The shack's wooden planks creaked with the wind, and her bones seemed to creak with them. She tried to curl up, hiding her face in her arms, but the cold pierced her skin like a blade. She thought of getting up to find firewood, but she didn't have the strength. She closed her eyes, hoping the night would pass quickly. Then she felt something placed over her, a thicker cloth, smelling of smoke and wood. When she opened her eyes, she saw that the man had taken off his own coat, the only one he had, and placed it over her. Then, without saying a word, he returned to his corner and lay down on the floor, now even more unprotected. The gesture hit her with silent force, stronger than any words could have. Claire didn't know how to react. The cold subsided a little, but the warmth she felt came from somewhere else, inside. She stayed awake all night thinking about it. It was just a piece of clothing, but it was the first genuine act of care she had received since arriving. For the first time, she felt that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't there only as a trade. Maybe she was still seen as a human being. In the silence of that night, lying beneath the borrowed coat, Clara closed her eyes not in fear, but in doubt. Who was that man who gave her what even her own family had denied? She didn't know. But something inside her began to change. It was subtle, but it was there. The seed of a trust she never thought she'd plant. The stranger's arrival was announced by the sound of a dusty car pulling up at the edge of the village. Vehicles were rare around there, especially one so shiny, completely out of place in the muddy and impoverished surroundings. The man who stepped out wore tailored clothes and shoes that looked like they had never touched dirt. His skin was clean, his hair neatly cut, and the perfume he wore lingered in the air even after he had passed. He walked through the village with confidence, as if he were there on a whim, not out of necessity. The children ran after him, curious, and the adults watched with suspicion. He didn't seem to be looking for help, but attention. When he reached the shack where Clara lived, he didn't hesitate. He clapped loudly and waited. Her husband came out to receive him, expressionless, while Clara watched from a distance, her heart tight. The two men spoke in low voices for a few minutes. Clara didn't understand what was said, but she sensed tension in the air. The visitor looked at her several times with growing curiosity, as if trying to understand what a young girl like her was doing in such a miserable place. When he left, he dropped a card on the ground and got into the car with a slight smile. The only sound left behind was the rising dust. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. The stranger's gaze stayed in her mind. It was the kind of look that weighs, that measures, that considers possibilities. For the first time, she felt that something from outside could threaten the fragile peace she was building in that shack. And even without knowing what was coming, she felt something big had begun to move. 2 days later, the same car returned. This time, Clara was alone in the shack. The man stepped out smiling, as if he were already expected. He brought a bag with new clothes, shiny sandals, and a box of imported sweets. Without ceremony, he placed everything on the table and sat down, like someone visiting an old acquaintance. Clara remained standing, unsure of what to do in the face of this unexpected intrusion. He began to talk. He spoke of his life in the city, of luxurious apartments, international trips, and parties with famous people. He said that the moment he saw her, he knew she was different. That she deserved much more than that rotting shack. That he could take her away right then and there and place her in a world where she'd never again have to carry water on her head or sleep on the floor. All it took was one choice. Clara listened in silence, her heart racing. His words were sweet and sharp at the same time. He promised freedom, beauty, education, and comfort, all things she had always dreamed of. He said he could be her savior, if only she agreed to leave behind that dirty, hopeless man she now shared a roof with. Each sentence came loaded with seduction and promises. When he finished, he leaned back with a satisfied smile, as if already knowing her answer. But Clara remained standing, looking at the items on the table as if they were golden traps. She didn't respond right away. Inside her, a war raged between what she desired and what she believed was right. And that indecision was beginning to shape the hardest moment of her young life. In the days that followed, the man returned several times. Sometimes with gifts, sometimes with words. In every visit he insisted that she deserved more, that she was wasting her youth beside someone with no future. Clara could no longer ignore what she felt. The world he described seemed so far away, so inaccessible, but at the same time, so tempting. For the first time, someone looked at her as if she had value. She began to imagine what her life would be like outside that shack. She thought of a warm bed, complete meals, new books, and clean classrooms. She pictured herself walking on smooth stone sidewalks, wearing clothes without patches. But along with those images came memories of the coat offered on a cold night, of shared food, of the silent respect given to her daily. The stranger didn't let up. He even threatened to take Clara by force, saying that place was unworthy of her. He began leaving gifts at the door, even when no one answered. The village started whispering, and Clara felt the weight of their eyes on her back every time she went to fetch water. The pressure grew like a storm about to burst, and she knew she'd have to decide. Between the dazzling world he promised and the quiet respect she had learned to admire, Clara was torn. She felt like a bridge between two extremes, the desire to escape pain and the gratitude for someone who, though poor, treated her with dignity. And as the nights passed, she knew her answer was already forming, quietly. It was on a gray morning that Clara made her decision. The man had returned with a final proposal, an apartment in the city, a scholarship, a monthly allowance, and total freedom, if she left with him at that very moment. He stood by the car, wearing a suit, holding the door open like it was the gateway to a new life. Clara stepped out of the shack slowly, eyes locked on his. She looked at the car, the gifts in the back seat, and finally turned to the shack. She saw the carefully stacked firewood, the clean cloth in the window, the coat still folded in the corner of the bed. She felt the weight of the choice in her hands. She could have everything she ever dreamed of, or stay where, for the first time, she had found something she never knew she deserved, respect. Clara then took a step back. Her bare feet touched the firm earth with clarity. Without a word, she turned her back to the man and returned to the shack. The car remained there for a few minutes, like a frustrated shadow, and soon disappeared in a cloud of dust. In the village, no one said anything, but everyone noticed. The girl had chosen silence, dignity, and uncertainty. That night, Clara slept deeply. There was no luxury, no abundance, no promises. But there was peace. The storm had passed, and her soul rested on solid ground. For the first time, she felt proud of herself. And without knowing it, she had taken the first step toward a truth that would change her life forever. In the days following Clara's refusal, the routine in the shack continued unchanged, but the world around them felt quieter. The man remained as reserved as ever, gathering fruit, bringing firewood, and sharing food without saying a word. Yet something in the way he moved had changed. There was less tension in his gestures, as if an invisible weight had been lifted from his shoulders. One afternoon, while organizing the house's few belongings, Clara found a small wooden box hidden under the man's mattress. The box was locked, but the key hung from a nail behind the door. Driven by curiosity and the oddness of such an item in a place so simple, she decided to open it. What she found made her heart race: documents with gold seals, bank cards bearing unfamiliar names, and photos of luxurious places. In one of the photos, the man appeared well-dressed at an event with important-looking people. Next to him, an elegant woman and an older man who seemed to be family. It took Clara a moment to understand what she was seeing. Everything in that box contradicted the image he had always shown. He wasn't just some homeless man. That box told a whole other story, a life he had hidden. Hands trembling, she closed the box and placed it back where she found it. She didn't know what to do with that information. She felt betrayed and confused. Why would someone hide something like that? What was the reason behind so many lies? Questions swirled in her head, and the only certainty she had was that the man beside her wasn't who he said he was. That night, Clara couldn't pretend everything was normal. Her eyes followed him with more intensity, and each silence now seemed to hide an entire universe. The man noticed the discomfort in the air but said nothing. He just sat in his corner of the shack and stared at the fire under the small pot of tea. The tension was thick as smoke. When the tea was ready, he approached to serve it, but Clara stepped back slightly. The subtle gesture was enough to change the atmosphere between them. He noticed. He took 2 steps back and stood, waiting, like someone facing a verdict. Then, without her saying a word, he walked to the mattress, pulled out the box, and placed it on the table. Calmly, he opened it, revealing what he already knew she had seen. There, without being pressured, he began taking out the items and laying them on the table. He showed her the photos, the documents, the bank cards. Then he pulled out a small leather wallet and took from it a crumpled photo of a young man laughing beside an elderly gentleman with white hair. It was him, years younger, standing next to his father, the founder of the Azambuja Group, one of the country's biggest business conglomerates. In a quiet, steady voice, he spoke his real name, Raphael Azambuja. Then everything became clear. Raphael wasn't a lost man. He was the heir to a fortune who had chosen to disappear from the world of luxury in search of something money could never buy, love without interest. For years, he lived among the poor, disguised as a vagabond, testing the intentions of those around him. And in Clara, the rejected girl handed over as a debt, he saw something he had never found in anyone else: truth. Clara felt her body tremble. Every memory of their days in that shack played back in her mind, now through a new lens. The cold nights, the respectful silence, the small gestures, they all gained new meaning. He wasn't just a man giving her shelter, he had been testing the world. And she, unknowingly, had been put to the test from day one. The mix of emotions was overwhelming. Part of her wanted to scream, to ask why he lied, why he placed her in that position. But another part, the quieter one, understood. She understood the pain of being surrounded by people who only came close out of interest. She understood the fear of trusting someone. And more than that, she understood his choice not to touch her, to wait, to respect, to observe. Still, she couldn't hide her disappointment. Not because he was rich, but because he had let her live a life of deception. Even if the shack was real, even if the poverty around them was real, the choice to be there had been his. She, on the other hand, had no choice. She was handed over. She bore marks he could never fully understand. That hurt more than anything. She stood slowly, looked him in the eyes, and walked out of the shack. She needed air. She needed to think. There were no fights, no screams, no tears. Just the silence of someone who understands too much to explode. And there, standing under the starry sky, Clara knew something had changed forever between them, but she didn't yet know if it was for the better or the end. The next morning, Clara returned to the shack with tired but steady eyes. She found Raphael sitting in the same place, as if he hadn't moved. He watched her enter without saying anything, his eyes filled with what looked like regret. Clara sat across from him, picked up the wooden box, and pushed it back toward him. She didn't need any more explanations. What she wanted now was to know what would come next. Raphael slowly stood, pulled a small envelope from his pocket, and placed it on the table. Inside was a handwritten letter. In it, he explained why he chose that place, why he chose to live the way he did, and how, from the first moment he saw her, he knew she was different. He said that if she wanted to leave, he wouldn't stop her. But if she chose to stay, he would give her not just his wealth, but his whole heart. Clara read everything in silence, feeling the weight of the words. There were no promises of castles, no fairy tale guarantees. Only sincerity, written in smudged ink and hesitant hands. When she finished, she looked at Raphael again. Not as the filthy man she once met, nor as the hidden billionaire she had discovered, but as someone who, like her, only wanted to be truly loved. And there, in the middle of that dusty old shack, a new bond was born. Not made of obligation or exchange, but of choice. Clara reached out and gently touched his hand. That simple gesture said everything that words could not. She chose to stay. And Raphael, without saying a word, knew he had found what he was looking for. At last, the truth had been revealed. The morning after the big revelation, the air inside the shack felt different. The silence that had once been filled with fear and mistrust was now replaced by a calmness, heavy, but honest. Raphael woke up early, left for a few hours, and returned with a backpack. Without saying anything, he placed it on the table. Clara opened it carefully and, upon seeing the contents, felt her heart race. Money. Neatly stacked bundles of fresh bills, more than she had ever dreamed of seeing in her life. Raphael pointed to the money and placed a folder on the table as well. Inside were documents from a company under his name, property deeds, and even a bank card with an active balance. All under his real identity. He had brought everything to the surface. Now, he was offering it all to Clara. With his eyes, he told her she could use that money however she wished, to start a new life, to study, to leave, or to chase any dream that had once been buried. Clara looked at the table, her eyes welling up. Her whole life had been marked by lack of food, affection, justice. Now, in front of her were all the leftovers of the world. But even in the face of such abundance, what weighed most was the meaning behind the gesture. Raphael wasn't trying to buy her forgiveness. He was giving her his past, his name, and the power to decide. She closed the backpack gently, looked at Raphael, and said nothing. Her thoughts were somewhere deeper than money. Yes, the money was a chance. But what should she do with it? How could she ensure that this new chapter truly belonged to her, and not just a continuation of other people's mistakes? That night, sitting under the starry sky, Clara finally broke the silence with carefully chosen words. She spoke about her dreams. She shared how she always wanted to study, how she secretly hoped to become a teacher or a nurse. She said she had always dreamed of having a simple home, with a small garden and a window with curtains. She wanted to help her siblings, but not repeat the emotional misery she had lived. Raphael listened attentively, as if hearing something sacred. When she finished, he pulled a small notebook from his pocket, its cover worn from time. Inside were notes on business ideas, social project sketches, and reflections. He explained that before disappearing, he had dreamed of creating a support center for homeless people. He wanted to use his fortune for something meaningful. But he had never found someone he could trust to walk that path with him. Clara listened, her heart full. Not because of the money, but because of the honesty in his words. They were two broken worlds trying to rebuild together. There were no castles, but there were plans. No fairy tales, but sincerity. And there, on the dirt floor, they began to sketch out a future. A plan where both had space, a voice, and direction. They spent the night sitting there, exchanging ideas and fears, like two children rediscovering the world. And in that exchange of dreams and vulnerabilities, they decided they wouldn't leave that shack as mere survivors, but as partners. And it would all begin with a fair, conscious choice, made out of love. The next day, Clara woke up early and began packing her few clothes into a bag. Raphael watched without asking anything. Then she took the money backpack, placed it on the table, and pulled out only a portion. With a calm voice, she said they would use it to rent a small place outside the village. Simple, but there's a clean, safe, and quiet space where they could start over. Raphael nodded, his eyes glistening. For the first time in years, someone was choosing to be with him, not for what he had, but for who he was. She wasn't running away with his wealth, but building something with his soul. Together, they gathered their belongings, closed the shack, and walked toward the road. Neither of them looked back. They arrived in the city with timid steps. They rented a small apartment at the top of a modest building with a view of the sunset. They bought second-hand furniture, cheap utensils, but everything was chosen together. The nights became filled with light laughter, fresh brewed coffee, and plans scribbled on old paper. Life finally had real texture. With part of the money, they opened a small cafe on the corner of the neighborhood. Clara cooked, Raphael served, and soon the customers began recognizing not just the food, but the energy of the place. There was something there that luxury could never manufacture: peace. And amidst oven time, spare change, and dish towels, the two discovered, day after day, the joy of a life built through choice. At the cafe's opening, only a few guests showed up. There was no ribbon cutting or grand speeches. But when Clara put on her white apron, she felt like she was donning an invisible crown, not one of gold, but of dignity. Raphael watched her proudly, wiping tables with a simple rag, his heart full of meaning. Their first customer was an elderly man who entered with slow steps and tired eyes. Clara served him with care, and he smiled, thanking her. It was a brief moment, but it was proof that they were on the right path. Every detail of that cafe was a reminder that scars don't have to define the future, they can be the foundation for something better. That night, after closing the register and cleaning the floor, the two sat down in silence. Clara held a mug of hot tea, and Raphael rested his head on her shoulder. Neither said a word. They didn't need to. Their closed eyes and soft smiles said it all. They had chosen together what truly mattered. And while the city slept outside, a new chapter began for the two of them. Not with luxury, but with purpose. Not with display, but with peace. And Clara, looking out the apartment window, felt for the first time that she was exactly where she was meant to be, not by accident, but by choice. Time passed like a gentle breeze over the new life that Clara and Raphael had built together. Between lovingly served coffees and late-night study sessions under worn-out lamps, Clara resumed her education. She enrolled in an adult education program, later passed the university entrance exam, and slowly became something she had never imagined possible: a real college student. Each diploma hanging on the wall of their small apartment was a silent symbol of resilience. Raphael supported her every step of the way, reviewing assignments, brewing coffee at night, waiting long hours in the library. And on that long-awaited day, Clara walked onto the graduation stage in a perfectly aligned gown, eyes brimming with tears, heart overflowing. She received her diploma with steady hands and the posture of someone who had overcome invisible battles. In the audience, Raphael applauded her standing, pride bursting from his chest. Not because of the title itself, but because of the journey. For seeing that girl who was once traded for food now celebrated for her own merits. For the woman who faced impossible choices and still didn't lose her tenderness. It was the crowning moment of a story forged in silence, respect, and love built from small decisions. At the end of the ceremony, while classmates rushed to take photos, Clara walked up to Raphael and hugged him tightly. No words were exchanged. That simple embrace said everything. In that moment, with the diploma in hand and peace in her heart, she knew she had become so much more than a survivor. She had become the owner of her own story. Over time, the little apartment became small for so much love. The cafe was thriving, Clara's studies advanced, and plans multiplied. But what filled the space the most was the arrival of something new: a child. Clara discovered the pregnancy on an ordinary morning, holding the test in trembling hands, eyes wide. She sat on the edge of the bed, laughing and crying at the same time. Raphael entered the room and knew instantly, without her saying a word. He embraced her from behind, with the tenderness of someone cradling a delicate promise. And there, in that quiet room, a new story began. The home filled up with tiny clothes, children's books, and a new kind of hope that flowed through the rooms like a spring breeze. The baby's birth was simple, but unforgettable. A strong boy, with curious eyes and an easy smile. Clara held him in her arms like she was holding the entire world. Raphael, by her side, cried quietly, grateful for every step that brought them to that moment. They were no longer just two people rebuilding the past, they were now three, writing a new future. Days went by in a whirlwind of bottles, laughter, and sleepless nights. But there were no complaints. What had once been a burden was now a celebration. And in that small home, far from spotlights and lavish feasts, lived a family that had found its greatest treasure, genuine love, born of pain, shaped by truth, and sustained by daily choices of loyalty and hope. A few years later, Raphael planned a surprise. He asked Clara to join him for a visit to a new neighborhood. They drove in silence, while she tried to guess the reason. They arrived at a large golden gate, in front of a mansion with classic architecture, surrounded by flower gardens and a fountain in the center of the courtyard. Clara looked around, confused, thinking they had taken a wrong turn. Raphael got out of the car, took out a set of keys, and handed them to her. He said this was the home he had dreamed of building as a child, but had never been able to complete for lack of meaning. Now, with her by his side, that place finally had a reason to exist. It was a gift, not to impress, but to thank. A symbol of all they had overcome together. Clara walked slowly through the garden, almost in a trance. She touched the white walls, sat on a rope swing hanging from a tree, and closed her eyes. It was real. But, unlike what she had imagined, what moved her most wasn't the size of the house or the luxury furniture. It was knowing that every stone in that place had been laid with love and intention. And there, on the sunlit porch, Raphael held her hand and thanked her. Not for her patience or strength, but for having stayed. For choosing love when everything seemed lost. And Clara, with teary eyes and a light heart, replied with a smile. The house was beautiful, yes. But what truly mattered stood right beside her, the man who had made her feel at home at last. On a peaceful afternoon, Clara sat on the garden bench with her son in her lap, watching the flowers sway in the wind. Raphael trimmed the bushes with a small pair of shears, whistling softly. The golden sun bathed everything in a calm, almost magical glow. In that moment, life didn't seem extraordinary, and that's what made it perfect. She thought of everything they had lived through, the humiliating exchange, the cold shack, the silent nights, the tempting offers, the truth revealed, the choice to stay. Every pain had been a seed, every decision, a root. And now, in that peace, they were harvesting the fruits of a story watered by true love. Raphael approached, knelt before her, and kissed her belly for the second time. Another life was on the way. Clara ran her fingers through his hair, smiling with the certainty that nothing had been in vain. Everything had a purpose. Everything had value. They didn't get there by luck, but by faith, courage, and loyalty. And while the boy in her lap dozed off to the sound of the breeze, Clara looked to the sky and whispered silently, "Thank you. For everything. For the hard beginning, for the pain that taught, for the truth that set her free." And there, in that quiet house filled with love, it became clear, she was not bought, not saved, she was chosen. And she chose back. Subscribe to the channel to watch the next story that will bring tears to your eyes. See you next time.